I'm talking to Martin Smith, who is the producer-director of this documentary about The Who's Tommy called Sensation, which is being screened on BBC4 on Friday.
Hello.
There's contributions from several key people in Pete and The Who's past back then, and the way in which it comes across is that when you have a switch between people, it's very seamless. And I was interested both on a technical level and also on an organizational level, how you achieve that. I mean, it seems to me a complex task, but I'm sure you've got your own methods. I was just intrigued to know more about that.
It's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
Yes, there are a number of factors involved in that. I mean, firstly, I have to decide what my story is. We had the story of Tommy, of course, but I had to decide what my story was running in parallel to that, which was how Tommy came to be made. And I had to do my research to find out the events that led up to the recording of Tommy, and prior to that the writing of Tommy. So first of all, I decided that the salient issues were the success that The Who had already had, what stage they were at in their career by the time we got to 1968, and what the future looked like for The Who if things had carried on the same level, if you like. Now, they had had tremendous success as a singles band. Each Who single was great. It was unique. It was eccentric. You never knew what you were going to get next. You had the ultimate teenage anthem in my generation, but then you had I'm a boy, but my ma won't admit it. You know, then you had I Can See for Miles, about jealousy. I can't explain. I can't articulate what I want to say. You know, it's something that I suspect so many of his fans were feeling at that time as teenagers. You know, each single was a fantastic little story, but it had a personal edge to it. It wasn't just a love song. There were really personal songs coming from Pete. And Pete felt that he had written the ultimate single in I Can See for Miles, expected it to be a huge #1 hit, but it just didn't do it. And he had ambitions beyond the 3-minute single, and these ambitions had sort of started to show on the albums that they'd made. Tracks like A Quick One, While He's Away, and Rail. And I think he saw the light that if he carried on writing for the singles market, the band would break up. So that was my jeopardy. But also, you know, we had to examine what was happening to Pete himself. 1967, The Summer of Love, hallucinogenics, his experience with drugs, his discovery of Meher Baba, the Indian guru. All these factors, I felt, were leading him in one direction, and that was to risk everything The Who had on trying to create an album of worth and meaning. And that was Tommy. Now, once I decided that those were my points in the story, I had to, you know, question my interviewees on all those points. And the way I do it, and I'm sure most documentary makers do it, is to ask people who were there at the time, if possible, people who experienced it firsthand, and we were lucky to have Richard Barnes and Mike McInnery and Richard Stanley, who were all friends of the band and particularly friends of Pete, and had been part of that process. Mike McInnery introducing Pete to Mayor Barber, for example, Richard Barnes giving the Who their name, Richard Stanley being a filmmaker who filmed a lot of their work. So I felt I had good people to tell this story. They could tell it firsthand. I had also decided that not to use a voiceover. Voiceovers are great and can come in really handy when you want to get somewhere in the storyline very quickly. And then Pete gave up drugs, you know, and discovered Mayor Barber. You can get rid of half an hour's storytelling in one sentence. But I decided that I wanted the people who were in the film to tell the story. And so by asking them similar questions, you get their own version of that. And when you've got all the transcripts back of the interviews, you have to sift through that and construct your story from the text.
Wow.
And therefore, you know, you're telling a particular story and you might have 6 people just tell each little bit of it. And that's how it's constructed, really.
Yes, you get a much more comprehensive angle on the reality of what's being described from different people's perspectives too, I think.
I think it's
Multicoloured.
You tend to believe the programme more. If you've got a voice that keeps coming in, say, and then Pete was very unhappy about this situation, well, you think, well, how do you know that? Who are you anyway? Who's that voice, and who's written that?
I often feel that when I'm watching the programme.
But you know, so you're putting thoughts and words into someone else's mouth, and much preferable to have Pete Townshend tell you how he was thinking,
Yes.
whether he loved or hated something, and the reason why he did this, that, and the other.
Yes.
That's why I favour programs that don't have a voiceover.
I would imagine you've come to some feelings about what is central to what the Who communicated musically, that innovated and contributed to music as a whole. I was curious to know what those major things are for you.
Well, I think when you look at the history of popular music in the 60s, it seemed to me the bands generally fall into 2 categories. There are the ones that follow and there are the ones that lead. And I always felt the Who led. And they led in the way that they played live on stage. I mean, that broke the mould. Pete's flirtation because of art school with auto-destruction led to that tremendous release of energy on stage, smashing his guitar, which then Keith Moon took up, couldn't be left out, wanted to get in on the act and destroyed his drums, and you know, the way that I think they used that device to release possibly whatever angst or anger they had inside them, and the way that connected with their audience, who I think, you know, the early 60s, mid 60s, they were the champions of the mod movement. They you know, the stuttering anger of that group of people was reflected in some of the songs that the Who wrote. I mean, the way that Pete Townshend wrote was unique. Storytelling. It wasn't I Love You, Doobie Doobie Doo. It was, you know, it was personal. It was, I'm a boy, but my mom won't admit it. You know, Substitute, My Generation. You know, the ultimate sort of teenage anthem. And the way that what Pete was saying in his songwriting connected to his fans, his audience, and yet, you know, Pete is a very savvy indeed, and realised, well, you know, the mod movement was not going to last. He had to move on. He had ambitions always to move on. If you look at the tracks on some of the albums like Quick One and Real, and even something like you know, Sunrise, these weren't snappy singles. These were ambitious, long, formulated passages. And I think there was a movement growing from mid-60s away from singles into albums, and albums were becoming incredibly important. And I think if you were to join an elite band of rock and rollers, you know, bands that were going to leave an impact on the history of popular music, I think you're going to have to produce an important album of worth and meaning. And I think Pete saw that as this culmination of his ambition to write a much, much longer piece, which then became and was termed a rock opera. I think he crystallized that sort of movement at the time. That was, you know, a lot of talk about concept albums, and I mean, the idea of a concept album has been around for a while. Even, you know, it's been said Frank Sinatra did concept albums, just in the mood of the songs that he was putting on any particular thing. But I think Pete took the concept and well, rounded it off and told a complete story from beginning to end. And if you look at the work he did post Tommy, it was basically more of that. It was a continuation of that theme, really. And so I think, you know, he opened the door to a lot of people to, you know, although they perhaps followed him to start with, but then made their own mark. I mean, if you look at Pink Floyd and yes, people like that, they were given the confidence, I think, through Tommy, the success of Tommy, to think to themselves, oh yeah, we want to do that and create something which is just more than a collection of good songs.
The nature of Tommy is quite, in a way, intense and sometimes dark in what comes across through it, and yet there were a lot of things that made the audience laugh, and there were a lot of things that somehow counterbalanced that intensity and made it very watchable, much more so than I thought it might be if it was more intense existential philosophical stuff. I was just curious to know how you approached organising that and how you work the sections of a film to balance that out. I'm sure it's not just the sequence of the music, there must be other factors too.
Well, I mean, it did, for me, start with the sequence of the music, because Tommy, being a rock opera, has a form, a beginning, a middle and an end, and it's difficult to tell that story backwards or from the middle out. So I did decide I was going to be loyal to the story, and wanted by the end of the film for people to understand the story of Tommy, because I was dealing with the record, which at the time wasn't particularly clear in some sections as to what was actually happening. You had to sort of read between the lines of the lyrics to find out certain things that were happening. So I wanted to try and make sure that at the end of my film people knew what the story of Tommy was, but also my parallel story was how it came to be, the making of, the circumstances surrounding it, what influenced it, etc. So the mood was set by the music of Tommy, the subject matter, like you say, the dark passages, the light passages. You know, Tommy covers is set in the starts off in the First World War. It has adultery, it has murder, it has bullying, it has child abuse, it has redemption and joy and euphoria and humour, and so that was the template. But my other story, how it came to be, I had to make sure that the bits of information we were giving fitted the mood of the music at the time, or in some metaphorical way matched the music. For example, when Tommy is cured, miracle cure, he becomes free and he sings "I'm free," and it's this incredibly uplifting moment when he has this sudden surge of information coming at him. He's seeing the world for the first time, and it's a great release, and he's flying almost like a bird. And I felt that Tommy at that moment illustrated what happened to Roger as the frontman of The who had been this mod. He'd been one of 4 disparate musicians battling on stage for attention, whilst Townshend was doing his bit, and you know, Entwistle was stoically sort of trying to steam the limelight by doing nothing. Moon, of course, you know, I mean, they were all trying to be the centre of attention, but Tommy gave him the opportunity to absolutely take centre stage and change his personality, free himself from the shackles of his mod persona. And he tells a story of how he was a mod with curly hair, and he had been straightening his hair for years so that he wouldn't get, one assumes, ridiculed by the mods. But Tommy was a release for that, and he became this curly-haired, bronzed, bare-chested god. He was one of the first rock gods, and I'm sure, you know, he should be getting a royalty from Robert Plant, you know, for stealing his look. So that was a good moment to tell that part of the story, to fit in with the right piece of the mood, but that was in the story of Tommy as well. There were some difficult passages to deal with, particularly, of course, the child abuse sections and the candid way in which Pete spoke of his own personal experiences of that. Tommy is very dark in places. How Pete was influenced to write it, you know, it contains sections which are quite intense. His drugs, his experience with hallucinogenics, his discovery of Mayor Barber. These are subjects which deserve their own program, and I had to be careful not to get bogged down in too much detail or stay with a particular mood for too long, because I felt I might well lose some of my audience. So luckily Pete and Roger and Richard Barnes, Mike McKinney, I mean, they're great interviewees and would provide moments of humour which we could inject to keep us going on a good entertainment level, but without.
But unprompted, though, that was a natural outcome of the interview process.
It was, yes. I mean, I think it's very important not to get too serious about Tommy. I mean, there are good moments in it. There are funny moments. There are ludicrous moments. But there are also some very serious moments where Pete is trying to tell us about how he was feeling and about how he saw his role as a celebrity, if you like, and what his relationship was with his fans. This is all wrapped up in the story. We had to be loyal to that, but we had to make an entertaining film at the end of the day. Yes. Just on a very basic level of mood, I utilised some music, some non-Tommy music, in the section where we're introducing Mayor Barber into the mix. I used an earlier track from The Who called Sunrise, which is a beautiful, beautiful track, and totally, in my view, fitted the mood of what was being said and explained. And in the long version of the programme, which is 80 minutes, as opposed to the UK broadcast version of 59, we go into a bit more detail about the circumstances leading up to 1968, when the recording of Tommy started, including why the band had no money. And I used the track It's a Legal Matter, an early Who track, underneath that section, a gift for a documentary maker. There were the two tracks, Underture and Sparks, which were instrumentals, and Underture being 9 minutes, gave a lot of lovely mood music that I could put under sections where we didn't want to be distracted by narrative or certain lyrical content.
Can you talk about the different versions of this documentary, please?
Yes, we made two versions. There was a 59-minute and an 80-minute. And this was because UK television wanted an hour slot, but the other territories around the world that would take a longer version, and also there will be a DVD release in 2014, March I believe, which will have the 80-minute version on. The 80-minute version allowed us to give a little bit more detail on the events leading up to the recording of Tommy in 1968. So more background on the band, more background on Pete's introduction to Mayor Barber, more thoughts on that 67 hallucinogenic psychedelic period, which, you know, the Who were on the periphery of, really, but they certainly experimented with it, and famously Pete had a bad experience which turned him against hallucinogenics. And I think it was important that that happened at the same time that he was being introduced to Mayor Barber. I think, like a lot of other people, he was looking for something else. He was looking for the meaning, shall we say, of life. Yeah. And Mayor Barber said, "You're not going to find it in hallucinogenics. You know, if you could find God by taking LSD, there's not much of a God." And I think that the combination of those two things were very influential in the writing of Tommy. It allowed us to take more time on some of the songs, it allowed us to spend more time talking about the artwork that Mike McKinney created for Tommy, which, you know, I think he created one of the iconic sort of album covers.
Yeah.
Certainly of the 60s. I mean, if not of all time, I think it's instantly recognisable. It ranks alongside Dark Side of the Moon, the famous prism. It's a beautiful piece of work, and we were able to get further thoughts on what was behind that, what was Mike trying to convey in that artwork, and the accompanying pieces of art that were in the booklet in the original release.
Oh yes.
So it really gave that extra 20 minutes, allowed the program to breathe a bit more and give a little bit more background to what was happening to the band at the time, and the events which all, the stars that all aligned in order for Tommy to be created. And it struck me that maybe if one thing hadn't have happened, maybe Tommy wouldn't have ever been created.
It's maybe not the way these things happen, but yes, I know what you mean. Yeah. Things
Maybe,
get drawn together.
I mean, Pete famously says that he'd written I Can See for Miles about 2 years before they released it, and he kept it sort of metaphorically in his back pocket until he'd run out of ideas, because he knew that that one would be a big hit. Maybe he wrote Tommy, had Tommy waiting to be released, but no, I'm sure he didn't.
Well, I Can See for Miles. William Walton, the composer, praised Pete for I Can See for Miles because it had these chords that descended, and the static chords would be kind of permeated by moving chords that passed through them, and he was very interested in Pete's method of construction, and that it was a composer's take on it being quite an advanced way of writing music.
Yes, I think Roger in the film, you know, refers to Pete's writing as the sort of new classical music. It was, like I say, each one of those singles was unique in that they didn't necessarily conform to the classic sort of single structure of the time, A, B, A, B, C, A, B, I think, as it was. So you really didn't know from one single to the next what you were going to get from Pete. He was experimenting all the time, and I think as David Wilde in the program says, who's eminent journalist and music writer, he considered I Can See for Miles as possibly one of the greatest rock records of all time. It's extraordinary to think that Pete wrote Tommy when he was 23. Yeah, it's an extraordinary feat. You know, prior to that, he'd even had, you know, ambitions that were far greater, it seemed to me, than his contemporaries. An extraordinary achievement. Yes.
Is more?
No. Do you want to ask me?
Oh, we could talk all evening.
Yeah.